What if I told you that one religious organisation has made more failed end times predictions than a weather forecaster gets wrong? From 1874 to 1975 and beyond, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society has consistently promised its followers that the end of the world was just around the corner. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. But what's truly remarkable isn't just that they were wrong. It's how they managed to maintain millions of devoted followers despite being spectacularly wrong, again and again and again. Let's start from the very beginning and work our way through over 150 years of missed predictions, failed prophecies, and creative explanations. The Russell Era. Our story begins in 1872 with a young entrepreneur named Charles Taze Russell. Now, Russell wasn't content with just selling men's clothing. Oh no, he had bigger plans, much bigger. After attending a Second Adventist meeting, Russell became convinced that Jesus Christ had already returned, invisibly. According to Russell's calculations, Christ had begun his invisible presence in 1874. And how exactly do you prove an invisible return? Well, that's the beauty of it. You can't disprove it either. It's like claiming you have an invisible pet dragon. Sure, I can't see it, but who's to say it's not there? Russell founded what would eventually become the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he was absolutely certain about his timeline. The end times had begun in 1874, and humanity had exactly 40 years to wrap things up. This brings us to Russell's most famous prediction, 1914. Now, to be fair to old Charles, he did get something right. 1914 was indeed a significant year. World War I began, and it was pretty much the end of the world as people knew it. But here's the thing. Russell wasn't predicting a world war. He was predicting the complete end of human governments and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Russell was so confident about 1914 that he published it everywhere. The Watchtower magazine, which began publication in 1879, was filled with articles explaining why 1914 was the year. They had charts, they had timelines, they had biblical calculations that would make a mathematician's head spin. But Russell had a problem. As 1914 approached and it became clear that world governments weren't going anywhere, he started hedging his bets. Suddenly, the prediction shifted from the end of the world to the beginning of the end of the world. It's like predicting your favourite sports team will win the championship, and when they make it to the playoffs, claiming you were right all along. Now, here's where things get really weird. Russell became absolutely obsessed with the Great Pyramid of Giza. He was convinced that this ancient structure was God's stone witness, containing prophetic measurements that confirmed his biblical chronology. Russell spent years measuring pyramid passages and chambers, convinced that every inch corresponded to a year in human history. He published detailed diagrams showing how the pyramid's measurements proved that 1874 was the beginning of Christ's presence and 1914 was the end of the Gentile times. Imagine explaining this to someone today. Well, you see, if you measure this ancient Egyptian tomb in pyramid inches and apply some creative mathematics, it clearly shows that Jesus returned invisibly in 1874. The fact that people bought this with complete sincerity shows just how powerful charismatic leadership can be. So what happened when October 1914 arrived and the world didn't end? Did Russell admit he was wrong? Did his followers abandon him? Of course not. Instead, Russell performed what would become the Watchtower's signature move, the prophetic pivot. Suddenly, 1914 wasn't about the end of the world. It was about the beginning of the last days. Christ had indeed returned invisibly, convenient, and now he was ruling from heaven. The earthly governments were still around, sure, but they were now living on borrowed time. Russell died in 1916, still convinced that the generation that witnessed 1914 would not pass away before seeing the complete establishment of God's kingdom. Spoiler alert, that entire generation is now dead and the kingdom still hasn't shown up. After Russell's death, control of the organisation passed to Joseph Franklin Rutherford, who liked to be called Judge, even though he had only briefly served as a substitute judge in Missouri. Rutherford was everything Russell wasn't: aggressive, authoritarian, and absolutely convinced that he knew exactly when the end would come. Rutherford looked at Russell's failed 1914 prediction and thought, you know what? Russell was close, but he got the details wrong. So Rutherford set about correcting Russell's chronology, which is a polite way of saying he made up new dates. Rutherford's biggest swing came with his prediction for 1925. He wasn't shy about this one. He went all in. According to Rutherford's calculations, 1925 would see the resurrection of the biblical patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and other Old Testament heroes. These faithful men would return to earth to serve as earthly representatives of God's kingdom. The Watchtower publications from this era are fascinating to read. Rutherford wrote with absolute certainty that 1925 was the year. Not maybe, not possibly, definitely. He encouraged his followers to delay major life decisions because the new world was so close. Here's a direct quote from Rutherford. We may confidently expect that 1925 will mark the return of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the faithful prophets of old. He even said that to doubt this would be to doubt God himself. Rutherford was so confident that he had a mansion built in San Diego called Beth Sarim, House of the Princes, to serve as a residence for the returning patriarchs. The house was complete with luxury amenities befitting biblical royalty. When the patriarchs failed to show up, Rutherford conveniently decided to live there himself. Nothing says I was wrong like moving into the house you built for dead prophets. Not content with just predicting dates, Rutherford launched what he called the Million Campaign in the early 1920s. The goal was to have 1 million people studying with Jehovah's Witnesses before 1925 arrived, because surely with that many people expecting the patriarchs, God wouldn't let them down. The campaign had catchy slogans like, "Millions now living will never die." Rutherford gave public lectures with this title, drawing massive crowds of people, desperate for hope in the aftermath of World War I. The message was simple. The generation alive in 1925 would live to see God's kingdom established on earth, meaning they would never die. Well, here's the thing about that million people from the 1920s. They're all dead now. Every single one of them. The entire generation that was promised they would never die has passed away, joining the ranks of everyone who has ever lived and died throughout human history. So what happened when 1925 came and went without any patriarchs showing up? Rutherford's response was, interesting. First, he tried to claim that the resurrection had happened just invisibly. Sound familiar? When that didn't work, he shifted the blame to the followers themselves, claiming they had misunderstood the predictions. But Rutherford's masterstroke was his explanation in the 1926 Watchtower. He wrote that he had been presumptuous in trying to predict dates, and that true Christians should simply remain faithful without needing specific dates. This from a man who had spent years telling people exactly when the end would come. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Rutherford managed to simultaneously admit he was wrong while maintaining that the organisation was still God's chosen channel of communication. It's like a weatherman predicting sunny skies for a hurricane and then claiming he was still the most accurate meteorologist in town. But Rutherford wasn't done. Throughout the 1930s, he continued making predictions, just more cautiously. He suggested that Armageddon would come before the generation that saw 1914 passed away. He hinted at specific years without committing fully. He developed what would become the Watchtower's standard operating procedure. Imply imminent dates without stating them directly, so you can later claim you never actually made the prediction. Rutherford died in 1942, still waiting for an Armageddon that never came. His funeral was held at Beth Sarim, the mansion built for patriarchs who never showed up. The irony was apparently lost on most attendees. After Rutherford's death, Nathan Homer Knorr became the third president of the Watchtower Society. nor learned from his predecessors' mistakes, sort of. He realised that making specific date predictions was risky business, but he couldn't resist the appeal of prophetic timelines entirely. Noah's approach was more sophisticated. Instead of making bold predictions himself, he allowed the organisation's publications to hint at dates while maintaining plausible deniability. This way, when predictions failed, the responsibility could be distributed among the anonymous writing staff rather than falling on one person. The crown jewel of Jehovah's Witness. Prophetic failures has to be 1975. This prediction was so significant that it deserves its own detailed examination because the build-up was absolutely incredible. It started innocently enough in the early 1960s with discussions about biblical chronology. The watchtower had calculated that Adam was created in 4026 BCE, making 1975 exactly 6,000 years from man's creation. Since the Bible speaks of God resting on the seventh day, surely the seventh millennium would be humanity's rest, the millennial reign of Christ. But here's where it gets interesting. The organisation never officially said, the world will end in 1975. Instead, they asked questions like, what will 1975 bring? And made statements like, how appropriate it would be if God's rest day began in 1975. The genius of this approach was that it created massive expectation without technical culpability. District overseers gave talks strongly implying 1975 was the year. Circuit assemblies featured talks with titles like, What Will You Be Doing in 1975? Kingdom Hall discussions centred around how close the end was. By the early 1970s, 1975 fever had reached epidemic proportions among Jehovah's Witnesses. Publishers were selling their homes, cashing out retirement accounts, and quitting careers to spend their remaining time in the full-time preaching work. After all, why worry about a pension when the world was ending in a few years? Young people were discouraged from pursuing higher education. What was the point of a 4-year degree when there might not even be a 1979? Marriages were postponed, children were not planned, and entire life paths were altered based on the expectation that 1975 would bring Armageddon. The Watchtower publications during this period are remarkable documents. They managed to build incredible excitement and expectation while technically never stating that the world would end in 1975. It's like a masterclass in manipulation through implication. Convention talks from the early 1970s are preserved on audio recordings, and listening to them today is both fascinating and heartbreaking. You can hear the absolute certainty in speakers' voices as they discuss how little time remains. District overseers would say things like, "Stay alive till 75," and audiences would erupt in applause. As 1974 turned into 1975, the anticipation became almost unbearable for many witnesses. Kingdom Hall meetings buzzed with excitement. Publishers compared notes on their preparations for the new world. Some spent their life savings on luxury items, figuring they wouldn't need money after Armageddon anyway. The organisation had created a feedback loop. The more excited the members became about 1975, the more the leadership felt justified in their predictions. After all, if God wasn't behind this expectation, why would so many faithful people feel it so strongly? Monthly reports showed unprecedented growth in the preaching work, as witnesses raced to warn as many people as possible before the end. The urgency was palpable. This wasn't just another religious prediction. This felt like the real deal. So what happened when December 31st, 1975 ticked over to January 1st, 1976? Well, the world kept spinning, the sun kept shining, and life went on exactly as it had before. The only difference was that millions of Jehovah's Witnesses woke up to realise they had been wrong. Again. The immediate aftermath was devastating. Witnesses who had sold their homes found themselves without equity in a rapidly changing real estate market. People who had cashed out retirement funds faced uncertain financial futures. Young adults who had skipped college found themselves without marketable skills in an increasingly competitive job market. But the psychological impact was even worse than the financial one. These weren't people who had casually believed in a prediction. They had reorganized their entire lives around 1975. They had made major sacrifices based on their absolute certainty that the end was near. The Watchtower's response to the 1975 failure was a masterpiece of corporate responsibility avoidance. Since they had never technically stated that the world would end in 1975, they claimed that any disappointment was the result of members' own overexcitement and speculation. A 1976 Watchtower article had the audacity to suggest that faithful Christians shouldn't need specific dates to maintain their urgency. The same organisation that had spent years building excitement about 1975 now claimed that true spirituality meant serving God without timeline expectations. Even more remarkably, they suggested that those who were disappointed by 1975's failure had served with wrong motives, implying that truly faithful people wouldn't have cared about the date anyway. This is like a cruise ship captain steering toward an iceberg and then blaming the passengers for expecting to reach their destination. After the 1975 debacle, the Watchtower became more cautious about setting specific dates, but they couldn't resist the appeal of prophetic timelines entirely. Their solution was brilliant in its vagueness: the generation doctrine. Based on Jesus' words in Matthew 24:34, "Truly I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur." The Watchtower taught that the generation that witnessed the events of 1914 would not die before seeing Armageddon. This was perfect. It created urgency without specifying exact dates. As long as people who remembered 1914 were still alive, the end could come at any moment. It was like a countdown timer that reset itself whenever it got too close to zero. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Watchtower publications regularly featured articles about how the 1914 generation was rapidly aging. They would highlight the declining number of people who could remember World War I, creating a sense of urgency without committing to specific years. Convention talks would feature elderly witnesses who had lived through 1914, presenting them as living proof that the end was near. These dear old folks became unwitting prophetic timepieces, their advancing age serving as evidence that Armageddon couldn't be far off. But there was a mathematical problem with the generation doctrine that became more obvious with each passing year. By the 1990s, even the youngest people who could possibly remember 1914 were in their 80s and 90s. The generation was literally dying off, and the end was nowhere in sight. The Watchtower tried various solutions to this problem. They redefined generation to mean people who were alive in 1914, even if they couldn't remember it. Then they suggested it meant people who were old enough to understand the significance of 1914. Each redefinition bought them a few more years, but the fundamental problem remained. People from 1914 were dying, and Jesus wasn't returning. By the mid-1990s, it became clear that the generation doctrine was headed for the same fate as all previous Watchtower predictions: complete failure. The oldest people alive from 1914 were approaching 100 years old, and even the most generous interpretation of generation was running out of room. In November 1995, the Watchtower published what might be their most significant doctrinal change ever, though most people didn't realise it at the time. In a relatively short article, they quietly abandoned the generation doctrine that had been central to their theology for over 80 years. The new interpretation was remarkably different. Instead of referring to the people who lived in 1914, generation now referred to the wicked people living during the last days, whenever those might be. It was like changing the rules of a game halfway through because you were losing. This change was handled with typical Watchtower subtlety. There was no announcement that they had been wrong for decades. No apology to the millions of people who had structured their lives around the expectation that the 1914 generation would see Armageddon. just a quiet redefinition buried in the pages of a religious magazine. The psychological impact on long-time witnesses was profound. Many people had literally organised their entire adult lives around the generation doctrine. They had made career choices, family planning decisions, and financial plans based on the expectation that they were living in the final years before Armageddon. But the Watchtower wasn't done redefining the generation doctrine. In 2008, they introduced the concept of overlapping generations, which has to be seen to be believed. According to this new teaching, the generation that Jesus spoke of actually consists of two groups: the anointed Christians who were alive in 1914 and the anointed Christians whose lives overlapped with that first group. This means that as long as there are anointed Christians alive today who knew anointed Christians from 1914, the generation continues. This is mathematical gymnastics that would make an Olympic athlete jealous. It's like saying you were present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence because you once met someone whose grandfather was there. The logical contortions required to accept this teaching demonstrate the incredible power of religious authority over rational thinking. As of today, the Watchtower teaches that the generation consists of anointed Christians whose lives overlap, potentially extending the timeline indefinitely. Since the organisation claims to identify new anointed Christians regularly, and these people could theoretically live for decades more, the generation could continue well into the 22nd century. This represents the complete abandonment of any meaningful timeline for prophetic fulfillment. The generation that was supposed to create urgency and expectation has become an elastic concept that can stretch to accommodate any timeline. It's prophecy without accountability, prediction without risk. Beyond date setting, the Jehovah's Witnesses have also made numerous failed predictions about world events and political developments. One of their most spectacular failures involves their interpretation of the King of the North from the Book of Daniel. Over the decades, the Watchtower has confidently identified various nations and leaders as fulfilling this prophetic role. The Soviet Union was the King of the North for decades, until it collapsed in 1991, leaving the Watchtower scrambling to find a replacement. They've suggested everyone from Nazi Germany to various Middle Eastern powers, always with absolute certainty and always wrong. Each failed identification requires creative explanations and new interpretations. The Watchtower has become expert at explaining why their previous interpretations were partial understandings that have now been clarified by new light from God. It's remarkably convenient how God's light seems to change whenever world events contradict their predictions. The Watchtower's blood doctrine has also undergone numerous changes that demonstrate their pattern of failed predictions about God's will. Originally, they banned all blood transfusions completely. Then they allowed blood fractions. Then they allowed some fractions but not others. Then they created complex charts showing which blood components were acceptable and which weren't. Each change was presented as new understanding from God, but the pattern reveals an organisation struggling to maintain relevance while avoiding the consequences of their earlier absolute statements. How many witnesses died refusing blood transfusions that the organisation now considers acceptable? This question is never addressed in their publications. The rise of the internet has created unprecedented challenges for the Watchtower's historical revisionism. Previously, they could quietly change doctrines and hope that members wouldn't remember or research the old teachings. But now, every Watchtower publication ever printed is available online, making it impossible to hide their track record of failed predictions. Websites dedicated to documenting Watchtower history have preserved every failed prediction, every changed doctrine, and every creative explanation. This historical accountability has made it much harder for the organisation to maintain their claims of divine guidance while continuing to make failed predictions. Despite their terrible track record, the Watchtower continues to make predictions about the future. They regularly publish articles about how current world events fulfill biblical prophecy, always with the implication that the end is very near. Climate change, political upheaval, and social changes are all presented as evidence that we're living in the final part of the last days. But they've learned to be more careful with their language. Instead of setting specific dates, they create expectation through questions and implications. Instead of making bold predictions, they suggest possibilities and probabilities. It's the same manipulation, just more sophisticated. After examining over 150 years of Jehovah's Witness predictions, the pattern is undeniable. Every single major prophecy has failed. Every date has come and gone without fulfillment. Every generation has passed away without seeing the promised new world. 1874, failed. 1914, failed. 1925, failed. 1975, failed. The generation doctrine, failed. And many more smaller predictions, all failed. This isn't a matter of interpretation or perspective. These were specific, confident predictions that simply did not come true. The organisation that claims to be God's sole channel of communication on earth has a perfect record of prophetic failure. But behind these statistics are real people who made real sacrifices based on these failed predictions. Millions of individuals have structured their lives around expectations that never materialized. Careers abandoned, education skipped, families delayed, savings depleted, all based on predictions that were simply wrong. The psychological trauma of repeated prophetic failure is difficult to quantify, but it's very real. Imagine organising your entire life around the expectation that the world will end, only to watch the date pass without incident. Now imagine doing this multiple times throughout your lifetime. Perhaps most troubling is the organisation's complete lack of accountability for these failures. There have been no apologies, no acknowledgements of error, no expressions of responsibility for the lives disrupted by false predictions. Instead, each failure is reframed as progressive understanding or blamed on members' overexcitement. This pattern raises serious questions about the watchtower's claims to divine guidance. If an organisation consistently makes false predictions while claiming to speak for God, what does that say about their authority? How many failures does it take before we recognise a pattern? Will the watchtower continue making failed predictions? Almost certainly. The organisation has built its entire identity around the imminent end of the world. Without that urgency, much of their appeal disappears. They need the end to be near to maintain relevance and control. But perhaps their track record of failure will finally catch up with them. In an age of instant information and historical accountability, it's becoming harder to hide from the consequences of prophetic failure. More and more people are asking the obvious questions. If they've been wrong about everything so far, why should we believe them now? The story of Jehovah's Witness predictions is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of unquestioned religious authority. When we stop asking critical questions and blindly follow human leaders who claim divine insight, we set ourselves up for disappointment at best and exploitation at worst. So the next time someone confidently predicts the end of the world, maybe check their track record first. If they've been wrong before, especially if they've been wrong repeatedly, maybe it's time to stop drinking the metaphorical Kool-Aid and start thinking for yourself. After all, the only thing we can predict with certainty about end times predictions is that they'll probably be wrong. History has a funny way of repeating itself, especially when it comes to the end of history.